There is so much research that proves without a shadow of a doubt that through taking sabbaticals, you can improve both your mental health and to a certain degree, physical health. That obviously depends on the activity that you're doing. It's not always a physical activity, for example. But I think that mental and physical health piece is really important. One of the things that I'd like to see more of is mini sabbaticals being able to be taken by staff who perhaps haven't been working there 10 years, but maybe after 5 years or even less, that they can have a sabbatical.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want to once more feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm really pleased to be joined by Rachel Hedley-Leonard of RHL Consulting. Now, Rachel and I have a conversation to share with you today which spans a whole range of topics. So we start off thinking about fundraising, and specifically fundraising within prep schools, although it's applicable to all schools what we have to share. And Rachel shares with us this idea that fundraising is hard, but often not in the way that people expect it to be. She also shares with us her thoughts on marketing and in particular finding your USP as a school, which is a topic that I've talked about before on the podcast. It's not always easy, but it is worth drilling down and trying to find your USP for your school, which is actually unique. That is what USP stands for, unique selling point. So the idea is to find something that is unique about your school. Rachel also talks to us about her sabbatical, where she went on a 630-mile walk on the southwest coast path here in the UK. And she reflects on the impact of the sabbatical on the way she thinks about her work, but also the importance of having time to think, or perhaps in some instances, time to not think, in the sense of time to do something completely different and allow your brain to do the thinking in the background. So I'm really delighted to be sharing with you this conversation with Rachel. Rachel has experience in independent schools, marketing, admissions, fundraising, and it's gained by over 30 years working in the education, charitable and commercial sectors. She was originally a teacher, head of department and senior leader, but now she offers her experience to schools as an independent consultant, and a wealth of experience it is. So she delivers training for schools and professional membership bodies, and she's also an experienced mentor. Her strengths lie in the areas of strategy, audit, research, development, startups. So as you can imagine, she and I have quite a lot to talk about to share with you today. So many people have told me that this podcast helps them, which is great because helping people is why I create these weekly episodes. And I also hear from lots of people who need a bit more support. For those schools, I facilitate strategy away days for governors and leadership teams. I guide heads and chairs of governors through the creation and implementation of new strategic plans, and I lead regular one-to-one strategy advice calls with heads and directors of development. And the best part of my job is hearing from the people I work with that they're clearer about what to prioritise day to day, they're better able to lead change in their schools, and they feel happier and more confident that they're making good strategic decisions. So anytime that you feel like you need a bit of extra help, just drop me a message so we can chat. You'll find my contact details at www.consultjuliette.co.uk. Hello, Rachel, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Fantastic to have you here.
Hello, Juliette. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. I'm really excited by the conversation we're about to have. So my first question, set the scene for us a little. What is it that drives your passion for education? Why is it that you've forged a career in this sector?
Good question. So I've got to go back a lot of years to answer that question. Some people will know, who know me, that I've been within the education sector for over 30 years now. In fact, my first career was in teaching. However, really, my passion for education started a long time before that. And I was brought up in Leeds in West Yorkshire, and I went to a lovely infant school in Leeds, which was a really, really good school. And at that time it would have been the early 70s, the Leeds Education Authority had a process, a system, an idea and a concept that if you were particularly shining in school, within your sort of academic life, they would advance you a year. Strange, I don't think it happens anymore, but it did happen in quite a lot of education authorities around that time. And at the tender age of 6 or 7, that happened to me. So I was advanced for the year. And it was a strange thing. And in hindsight, I'm not sure that it was a good thing. There were all sorts of sort of problems that created later on. But what it meant was that my education was accelerated. My parents wanted to send me to the local independent school, but they weren't well off, and they were worried that I wouldn't be able to achieve a scholarship without sort of dropping back a year. So there was that whole dilemma really of whether to do that or not. And in the end, they decided not to. They decided to keep me in the state system and not put me through the whole bursary scholarship process. But as I grew older, it became very obvious to me that I was in a secondary school that really wasn't challenging at all. In fact, I'm not sure I should mention it now, but I actually went to the same school as Liz Truss, which perhaps is something that I could mention a while ago, and I certainly cannot mention now. But I went to the same school as Liz Truss, and you'll have perhaps heard Liz say that she sort of got to where she got against the odds, and it was difficult. It was a tough school, and I really had that sense by the time I was 16 that I wasn't being pushed. So what I learned was that, it was possible, and perhaps it could have been more possible had my parents gone down the scholarship and bursary route. And so I was fascinated by the idea of trying to get the best out of every child, not just the children who were sort of privileged enough to be in the independent sector. And that was the start, really, of my journey. I then went to a girls' grammar school for my 6th form, and things sort of improved from there. But that started my absolute interest in both education and in particular in bursaries and scholarships within the independent sector. So although I started off teaching in a state school, I moved over to the independent sector because I was just fascinated about this, the opportunities really that could be afforded to all children. So it's a long answer to your short question.
No, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that almost every time I ask that question, people go back to their own education experience themselves. And I think what I find really interesting is actually it's not always a massively positive story. Sometimes it is, but quite often there's a sense of this wasn't as good as it could have been, and I wanted to do better. And I always reflect on the fact that that's also true when I'm talking to major gifts prospects as well. Like back when I was fundraising, people would assume that you had to have had the most amazing time at the institution in order to give a gift. That's not the case, that you can often help someone to come to terms with things that weren't ideal because they're having a sense that they can make a difference and make it better for future generations. And I think absolutely, it's really interesting to see that it's not always a positive kind of experience that people have had.
No, you're absolutely right, Juliet. And I think it's about giving back as well. And I think you're right. Sometimes even the opposite is true, as you've just said. So that if your experience wasn't, quite what it could have been, then you almost want to give back even more. You want to put it right for the people who have yet to come. Exactly. So it's true, but that was certainly the driver for my interest in education, and it's lasted all this time. It's lasted over 30 years, and I've done very well and I've been successful, but it's been a privilege, I think, to be in 2 different situations where I can affect change. And one through my teaching career, where I became a senior leader, head of department, etc., and helping children with additional needs as well, learning needs, but also in my career as a fundraiser and a marketing consultant, I've been able to do that as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So one of the things that I hear quite frequently that I'd love you to kind of debunk this myth for us is that there's this assumption that not all schools can fundraise. And I find it really interesting because I used to hear when I worked in Cambridge and Oxford University development offices within the colleges, everyone would say, oh, it's easy for you because, you've got this amazing pool of prospects. And I'm thinking, no, it really isn't that easy. We just have to, have the right strategies in place and work really hard. And then you hear the same within the university sector. Everyone says, oh, it's easy for the universities to fundraise, easier than the schools. And then the prep schools saying, oh, it's easier for the senior schools to fundraise, all through schools. It's much harder for us as prep schools. Yeah. In actual fact, I don't think that's true. I think any school or any education institution can be successful at fundraising. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, particularly because you've got that real depth of experience in the prep school fundraising area.
Yes, exactly. And that's the area that particularly interests me is prep school fundraising and prep. But before that, and I think this is the important and the crux of the matter, prep school community relations. I'll come back to that if I may. I just wanted to agree with one point that you made, which was fundraising is hard. It's not easy. It's not easy for any school, for any university. It's not easy for any charity. I've worked with charities in fundraising as well, and it's not easy. I think people think that a magic wand will be waved when they have a development director and, all of a sudden the fundraising will happen. It's not easy at all. It's hard work, but it's not necessarily hard work in the way people expect it to be. And that's very much the case with prep school fundraising. So I think it, as you will know, Juliet, it boils down to community relationships because that's where it all starts. Many people have said, but also a former boss of mine used to say, people give to people. They don't give to organisations. They give to people. And it's in building those relationships that you develop those relationships and they grow and you end up being in a much easier fundraising position. So I think the first thing for prep schools to understand, prep schools always say to me, well, I don't see how we're going to do this. Or sometimes they say, we're not going to do this because people who go through our school then have another 2 alma maters after us. And absolutely, that's usually correct. They've got their senior school and then they've got the university, or not always, but generally. But for many people, their prep school or their primary school are their formative years. They're the years that meant the most to them. They're the years that have the most poignant memories. They're the years that their parents remember so fondly, usually, and where their parents made friends with other friends that sometimes lasted for life. I'm meeting with a friend next week who we've known since our children were at infant school together. So I think it's really important to remember that there's a huge strength there that senior schools and universities don't actually have. So that's the first point. The second point is that it's about this building of relationships. And what I would always suggest to a prep school is to start by looking at their community relations. Now, that's often called alumni relations, and that's fine. That's something that schools should do. But I also mean the wider community. So their parents, their former staff, their current parents, everyone within that community. And what I have found to be true is that schools that have been brave enough to say, do you know what? We are going to try this. We are going to try and develop alumni relations and hopefully turn that into something that generates perhaps more fruits than we'd anticipated. They find that there are so many benefits that come from those strengthened community relations, in particular alumni relations, but not always, that the fundraising side of things is almost an organic growth from that. It's not something that you then you do have to work hard. We've just been talking about that, but it's something that people come out of the woodwork and people want to help. And it's a bit like we were saying earlier about wanting to give back, So I would say to any prep schools listening that it is possible. Alumni relations is possible, fundraising is possible, development, as the very strange term that we use, is possible in prep schools. I don't know if you agree with me.
I 100% agree. And I think that your key point there around the fact it's the strength of the relationships that people have with the institution of whatever type is the most critical part of the equation of working out whether fundraising is going to work. Because And there's if we assume somehow that senior schools have it easier than prep schools and that universities have it easier than senior schools, we're assuming that somehow the strongest relationship is with the last institution you were connected with, which is completely false. Like why would that be? In some cases, that will be the case, but by no means a foregone conclusion. And so finding the methods that you can use to strategically build those relationships and rekindle, in some cases, those relationships is the key. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of schools go into fundraising thinking it's easy, and it isn't. But at the same time, by developing the relationships, you often get to a point where, I remember, significantly experienced development directors telling me, like, you don't really need to ask. This idea of being nervous about making the ask is a complete misnomer, because you should actually be conveying an inspirational reason that people would want to help. And whatever that is then evolves into a very natural conversation where, there may be a question which is actually officially an ask, but it's not some kind of scary set piece kind of structured process. It's a conversation between individuals who care about a shared outcome. The fundraising is hard work, but it's not as difficult as you might think within a prep school environment.
That's right. And I remember someone saying to me, and it's a sentence that I have repeated time and time and time again over the last 15 years of fundraising, which is, in fact, I can remember exactly where I first heard it. I'd gone to, very early on in my journey, I think it was when I was doing some charitable fundraising, and I'd gone to an asking workshop, where you sort of learn how to make the ask. And as you say, in many cases, it's a nonsense, really, because that's not how it happens in real life. But one thing that I did pick up from there that was really, really true and important was, you can't see it as asking people to make a donation. You are giving people an opportunity. And that changed my whole outlook on fundraising. Stop thinking about asking people to give, but think about it as giving people an opportunity to do something that will make themselves feel good. And I think that's really, really important, because it just flips the coin about and it becomes a completely different situation, and one that you feel more comfortable with.
And it forces you to articulate what opportunity you're giving them, which means you've got to have that case for support. You've got to have a clear, inspirational, kind of emotion-led case for support as to why people should give. And then it is giving them an opportunity. Giving them an opportunity by just passing them a donation form isn't an opportunity. Isn't an opportunity. That's making it. I think you're absolutely right. The other area that you focus on, I know, is marketing. And I think that there are some commonalities here between fundraising and marketing. And if we take a look at the big, wide sector that they both come from, they're actually very close cousins with regards to the techniques and the approaches that we use. And one of the things that I think is also a misnomer within the marketing world, the school's marketing world, is this idea that marketing your school is somehow being brash and pushing out your idea and claiming you're the best ever at, XYZ. And it feels to some schools like that really clashes with their values around humility, around the idea of presenting others in a good light, but not necessarily taking the spotlight themselves. And I think there's a crossover there with this attitude towards fundraising of making the ask versus giving people an opportunity to give. There's this sense of marketing sometimes feels a bit alien to people who are coming through the leadership ranks from the teaching world. What do you think about this idea that you need to be brave in your school marketing and put out there how good your school is, not for the benefit of your school, because then you can attract children who are going to really benefit from being at that school?
Yeah, absolutely, Juliet. And it's a really interesting topic. And I do come across lots of schools who feel that perhaps marketing their school either isn't necessary or sits at odds with their underlying ethos. So, there are two questions there. I think that the schools that feel it's not necessary I would say an important point, quite often heads will say to me, well, we don't need to market our school because we're full. And that's great. I say, well, fabulous. That's great that you're full. And, what does that mean? Well, it means we've got, lots of enthusiastic children who are experiencing the best education that they can. And we're happy because, we have met our targets, the number enroll or what have you. I would say from a commercial point of view, which doesn't directly answer your question, but from a commercial point of view, schools need to be marketing their schools at exactly that point, because what you want is for your prospective families to see your school at its buzziest, at its best, at its most exciting. And quite often, if you wait for when there's a dip in your fullness, as it were, then people aren't quite seeing your school in the same way. So my answer to that would be to absolutely mark when your school is at its peak. In terms of brave marketing, and this is a topic that I'll be speaking at actually at a conference in the new year. Brave marketing, when I ask delegates at conferences or staff in schools what they think marketing is, they come back with all sorts of answers, as you might expect. But really, what I say to them in response is marketing is about listening and it's about communicating. And if you can do those two things, then you are marketing your school incredibly well. Because for the schools who worry about being brash and, being very shouty and it not sitting with their ethos, what you're actually doing when you're marketing a school is listening. You're listening to what your community wants. You're taking time not to talk at them, but to listen to them and to say, tell us what it is that you want from the school. I often talk to schools about research, and I often ask them, how do you know? How do you know what parents want if you're not listening to them? So I think that's a really important point to make first, about listening to your community, listening to the stakeholders in your school. But I think then you have to be brave about communicating what it is you have to offer that your parent body wants. And just on a slightly different but related tack, whenever I go into schools to talk to the whole staff, so I talk to the whole academic and support staff about marketing, I will always ask them what the school's USP is, what makes their school unique. And I use an interactive tool so they can all vote and type in answers and so on. What they don't know is that my next slide brings up the answers that they're going to give, because you can bet your bottom dollar every single school that I go to will say their USP, and bearing in mind, let's remember what the U stands for, is exactly the same as every other school. So the reason I think brave marketing is so important is every school says that their USP is small class sizes, brilliant extracurricular provision, wraparound care, etc., etc. But every school is saying the same thing. So that's where you need to differentiate. And I think being brave is about having the courage to differentiate your school, not just from the other schools in your area, but from all other schools, by picking that one underlying ethos that runs through your school that stands for something quite different from perhaps the other schools. And I see some fantastic examples of brave marketing in my work. But I also see some examples of very bland marketing, and marketing that to me doesn't show they've been listening. So yeah, that takes me full circle really back to the listening.
Absolutely. I love the fact that, USP obviously stands for unique selling point. And then,
yes.
And people, when they answer that question, will acknowledge, well, this is probably the same as everyone else says, but these are our USPs.
Yes.
So I have 2 points of view on this. I'd love to hear your reaction, your response. But so one of them is that emotion is normally the root of your USP. That you can probably say the same stuff as everyone else, but what can mark you out as different is that you actually believe it and you show it and you help parents on open days, etc., to actually feel that it's different. Yeah. And so often if you can find a word or a phrase which is emotion based as a USP, that's going to mark you so much ahead of the competition compared to there being another value based USP, in my opinion, and value as in the values that we want children to have and to leave school knowing that they are, I don't know, kind of authentic or resilient. I mean, these are important phrases, but that's not the same as an emotional USP. And the other area that I think that schools really have opportunities that they don't always take up is around thought leadership as a USP. So the fact that we're educators, we're schools, come on, we should be able to, at least when people want this, and they won't always want the detail, but we should be able to articulate in a clear way why we do what we do and why we believe that is the best way of educating young people. And so creating thought leadership around what is it that you believe as a school is the secret sauce, if you like, to your educational experience that you offer. And I very rarely find schools doing that in a compelling and consistent way, creating a thought leadership position. It can't be instead of the emotion. You kind of need both. But I do think there's opportunity there. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely, Juliet. And I'll pick on both of those. So I think the feeling, the USP, the emotional USPs is really, really important. And interestingly, I think despite all the brilliant work that schools did in taking everything online during the pandemic in terms of open days, I think schools really struggled because it's so much more difficult to convey that feeling through the digital world. Now, of course, it's possible. We see some fantastic examples of school films. Every time I see another school film out of one of the stables that produces such amazing films, I think, wow. And often, if I'm honest, it stands the hairs up on the back of my neck. It can reduce me to tears even. And that's fantastic. But I think lots of schools weren't able to produce that so quickly. So I think schools really missed out there. And I think schools perhaps understand now that it is about feeling. It's about that feeling when you walk into a school, that feeling when you're being shown around by pupil guides, etc. So I think that is difficult. On the second point that you make about thought leadership, I don't know if you found this, Juliet, but when I go and run workshops with schools, I find sometimes the reason that they're not articulating what it is they actually believe in is because they haven't actually nailed that yet.
Yes.
And often schools are firefighting, heads are firefighting constantly every single day. They're still picking up the pieces post-pandemic. But even if they weren't, they're still firefighting every day. And I think heads and senior leadership teams and staff as a whole don't allow themselves the luxury of time to devote to thought leadership.
Yes.
And so, once they do, you can sort of sit around and they will say at the end of a day or at the end of a weekend or whatever it is that you're doing with them, wow, of course, this is what we've been trying to say all along, but we just haven't managed to articulate it. And so for me, it's about allowing those people the time to get together to just cement what it is they're trying to show before they even try to show it. Does that make sense?
It does, 100%. And I think you're right that a lot of people will have an instinct about what it is that they believe in terms of the educational kind of approach or pedagogy that they're using within the school, but they haven't been able to share that with others. And then to kind of really, an area of open honesty, kind of thrash out the alternatives that come out when people do share. Because often people are in the same ballpark as each other, but they're not quite aligned. And then once you've got an opportunity for people maybe in a facilitated conversation to really understand, okay, these are the pieces of the puzzle that we're going to put together, and we're going to be able now with clarity explain why what we do is really important for the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. And the big one that trips people up is this fake dichotomy between the idea that people will say, we're not all about exam results, we're about holistic education. And yet exam results are really important. And that sort of circular reasoning and helping them to understand, okay, so normally the root of it is something around we want children to be happy and resilient, and that enables them to be the best learners they can be, which enables them to get the best exam results they can get, which enables them to lead a fulfilling life later on, etc., etc. So
Yes.
there is a train of thought, but it's pretty woolly in most schools.
No, absolutely. And it's something that lots of schools, and particular school leaders, do struggle with. It's that dichotomy, as you say, or fake dichotomy. And they think that it's incompatible, really. And it's finding a way, or helping schools to find a way to articulate the compatibility of those two things.
Yeah,
exactly
that. Fantastic. So taking a step back a little bit, I've heard you talk about the 3 R's, and these are not the standard 3 R's you might think about in an educational context. Tell us a little bit more about this underpinning kind of foundation that you need to put in place if you're going to be successful in your marketing and fundraising.
So this is something I feel really, really passionately about, Juliet. And I'm sure people must know me as the consultant who talks about the 3 R's all the time. And I do. And of course, as you said, we're not alluding to the reading, writing and arithmetic. Always such a funny one. But we are talking in marketing terms about recruitment, retention and reputation. And for me, those 3 things are the 3 pillars of a school's marketing success. And so without acknowledging the importance of those 3 things, I think we've sort of lost our way a little bit. And I think that needs to be the point at which the springboard from which all our marketing comes from, really. So I think most schools focus on 1, sometimes 2, but rarely 3 of those things at the same time. So I think most schools focus on recruitment, because what they want to do is make their schools successful, and they want the children within those schools to be successful, and they want to recruit children to their school. So they focus on that, and they think about, and they put lots of time and effort into how are we going to get children to our school. Hopefully, as well, they'll be focusing on the reputation of the school. And we both know, and I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast will know, that word of mouth is by far the best tool for marketing. And so reputation is hugely important. But I think sometimes schools forget about retention. And for me, it's just as important. Now, this doesn't matter whether you're an all-through school from 3 or even younger, even, infants, right the way through to 18, or whether you're a prep school. I think it's still important to be retaining those pupils, retaining those children at every point on that journey. So I guess it's just about, it's about the customer journey as well. It's about the customer journey from the moment that they have a child, really. I mean, I'm sure we all know families who are pregnant for the first time and think about where their child's going to go to school. So it's that customer journey from that moment when the parents start thinking about school for their children, right the way through to, well, after the children have left. And recruitment, retention and reputation is about looking after those families at all those stages. The customer journey is something that I also feel very passionate about, and I make no apology for using the word customer either. But so that's the context really of the 3 R's.
I think you're right, and I wonder whether the reason that the retention takes us a back seat slightly is because of the 3, that's the one that the marketing and admissions team possibly have the least direct influence over. So recruitment is clearly within the marketing admissions team's remit, pretty much within their control. Reputation is largely within their remit and control, pending things that happen that are beyond their control. But retention actually is, and as you say, customer journey, is the delivery of the promise.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
is made during that recruitment phase. And that retention is therefore everybody's job. I mean, all of marketing is everyone's job, but retention in particular. And I think it's compounding that. It also has to be based on systems, which are often not very robust. So identifying... so we have systems within schools that identify, safeguarding, identify pastoral risk. All those things are very, very robust. What tends not to be as robust is when there are concerns and complaints and unrest amongst pupils or parents, which doesn't escalate to the level of a complaint when it will be handled, efficiently, I'm sure. But it's just a signal that an extra care and attention needs to be given to that particular group in order to retain their custom, as you say. And And those signals are not being spotted, and they're not recorded and passed on to the right people with the right time frame.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've seen as well? Because that's certainly something that I've identified.
It is, absolutely. And it's why one of the things that I talk to schools most regularly about is this important point of whole school marketing. I used to talk about gardener to governor or governor to gardener, and how it's everybody's responsibility. And I really like your term delivering the promise, because that's what it is. You know, we have spent, the marketing, the admissions team have spent sometimes up to 3 years persuading and promising parents, and then they get to the school and that promise isn't always delivered, and things can just go unnoticed or not picked up on. And it's those systems and processes, like you say, that perhaps just aren't as slick as they need to be in terms of responding to issues. And I will sometimes talk about customer service that we would receive, for example, in Waitrose or in John Lewis, and in places where the organisation is known for its customer service, where slip-ups may happen, but if they do, they're dealt with efficiently and, more importantly, to the satisfaction of the customer. And I think that's a really important point for schools as well. And fortunately, unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, to me, it's neither. That lies in the hands of the academic staff, the teaching staff. It lies in the hands of the ground staff. It lies in the hands of the estates team. And often it can lie in the hands of the catering team. Catering is so important to parents. Less important to children, but it's so important to parents. And so those systems and processes for picking up niggles when they're wrong, or conversely, for making a child's day absolutely superb, run through every single area of the school staff. So, yeah, I have noticed that a lot, and I think it's crucial, but it's an area that's perhaps not focused on as much as possible.
Yeah, definite opportunities there. So I'm going to change gears slightly as we come towards the end of our conversation. You mentioned before having time to think, and I think you described it as a luxury, which I'm sure you said in the moment, but it isn't a luxury. This is a key part of leading a school or leading any organisation, is carving out the time to think. And I'd love for you to share with us, you have just very recently been on a very impressive sabbatical involving a lot of miles covered on foot. Tell us a little bit more about what you did, and more importantly, what you think you can learn or you can kind of teach the sector about the role of sabbaticals and time to think.
Yeah, certainly. So impressive, I'm not so sure, but exciting, exhilarating, and just absolutely superb it was. So I took a 2-month sabbatical from my consultancy work. It was difficult to carve out that time, but I worked really hard for 3 years knowing I was going to carve out that time. So I took a 2-month sabbatical and I walked the entirety of the South West Coast Path, which starts in Minehead in Somerset. It goes all the way down the north coast of Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, round the bottom, and comes all the way back and finishes in Poole in Dorset. 630 miles, elevation 4 times the height of Everest. But that's enough of that. It was fabulous, but it did give me lots and lots of time to think and reflect. Quite often, though, what was most surprising about my sabbatical is that I didn't do that much thinking at all. What I did was I spent time in the moment. So lots of people said to me when I got back, gosh, what on earth did you think about? You know, what life-changing decisions have you made? And my common answer really was, none. I haven't really changed anything dramatically, and I haven't really set off in a different direction. However, 2 things I have done. One, I've had time to be in the moment. And that, I guess, is a form of meditation. Now, meditation is something that I'm not particularly good at home. My brain is too busy and my mind is too active. But it gave me time to be in the moment. But the consequence of that I'm only just realising now I'm back from my sabbatical, and I've been back, just over sort of 5 or 6 weeks, is that actually having that time to be in the moment has led to changes in thought processes. It has led to decisions about things and other things I want to do, or things I want to do within my consultancy that I want to do slightly differently and want to do better. So it was all happening in a kind of subliminal way.
Yeah.
And it's only on reflection that I've realised it was happening. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
It does. And it's backed up by the research. I'm not an expert in neurological research, but I do know that a lot of these thought processes happen subconsciously. That's why when you're doing something that requires, like walking in your case, but it might be cooking dinner or walking the dog, or doing something where your or driving the car is the other one. Your brain is mostly occupied by keeping you safe or keeping you driving in the right lane, etc. But there's enough space, you're enough on autopilot that there's another part of your brain that can freewheel off in all sorts of random different directions that you can't anticipate, you can't always direct, but what you end up with is what feels like either a revelation or an instinct, but is actually rooted in the underlying thought processes that continue even though your brain is occupied on something else. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear you explain it in that way, and to know that I've had this, not in that length of time as a sabbatical of 2 months, but in moments, it's absolutely something that I felt as well.
Absolutely. And I think there are 2 points there I'll come back on. One is, I think the keeping safe thing I find really interesting, because actually the walk that I was doing, a lot of the time I was keeping safe. I was on a cliff edge for a lot of the time, quite literally. And I was sometimes in quite horrific weather. So I needed to keep safe. So that's interesting. But that subliminal activity that's going on is fascinating. As you say, there has been so much research done into this. But another huge benefit, if you like, from sabbaticals is the mental and physical well-being, because there is so much research that proves without a shadow of a doubt that through taking sabbaticals, you can improve both your mental health and, to a certain or greater degree, physical health. That obviously depends on the activity that you're doing. It's not always a physical activity, for example. But I think that mental and physical health piece is really important. Now, one of the learnings that I've had from the sabbatical, and relating that to the education sector, I know that some schools, many schools, in fact, do have sabbatical policies for people who've been employed there for 10 years plus. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. I would be a great advocate in all staff, after a minimum length of service, being able to take a sabbatical of some sort. Of course, there would need to be guidelines around that. I was at the ISC launch of their Celebrating Partnerships event a few months ago, and we were talking about sabbaticals there, and lots of schools were incredibly keen to develop a sabbatical policy. But of course, they do need to consider the cost to the organisation, the cost to the school, and how they best go about that. But one of the things that I'd like to see more of is mini sabbaticals being able to be taken by staff who perhaps haven't been working there 10 years, but maybe after 5 years or even less, that they can have a sabbatical. Now, a sabbatical doesn't have to be 2 months long. I'm not sure what the definition of a sabbatical is, but it doesn't have to be 2 months long. And it can be any break that allows you to go through the same thought processes that I had, allows you to have that almost meditative time where you're subconsciously coming back. But I think the key thing is for schools and organisations and businesses to understand that the benefits to them are also huge, as well as the benefits to the person who's taken the sabbatical. Because quite often, I know my consultancy, for example, has benefited hugely from me having that time away. And I know that schools benefit hugely from their staff having that time away, and they come back so regenerated with lots of different ideas, and directions to follow. So I think there's a lot of positivity out there, for the sabbatical person taking the sabbatical, but also the organisation allowing it.
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
enabling it, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. I was lucky much earlier in my career to take a 6-week sabbatical to travel around Costa Rica. And I remember my boss, when I returned, I've been back about 2 months, and she just said to me, "Don't take this the wrong way, but I had no idea what you were capable of," because I'd always seen, because she'd come in when I was already absolutely exhausted, like coming into the organisation after I had. And she said, "I can see now what you're doing is so at such a higher level of strategic thinking, creative thinking, and has so much more impact than what you were doing before. And I took that in a positive way, that I was right. I was exhausted and I needed that time off.
Yeah.
And that by doing something that was constructive and interesting to me enabled me to really switch off from the work.
Exactly.
And the impact that it had on me was really positive, but the impact it had on the organisation was what she was reflecting on, and for her that was really quite significant. So thank you so much for sharing your story around that, Rachel, and really interesting to hear about your views on prep school marketing, or prep school fundraising I should say in particular, brave school marketing. I love that phrase, and the idea of really finding that USP and being brave about it, and also the way you've then talked about having that time in the moment and the positive impact of your sabbatical. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Juliet.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.